My dear friends, let me ask you something that might hit close to home. Have you ever given everything to someone you love, only to have them turn their back on you when it mattered most? Today, I want to share with you a story that will make your heart ache and then soar. A story about Maggie Simmons, a 68-year-old woman whose quiet strength changed everything in the most unexpected way. This isn't just any story. It's one of those elderly wisdom stories that reminds us that sometimes the most powerful response is silence itself. Margaret, or Maggie, as those closest her called her, wasn't the type of woman you'd notice in a crowd. She stood about 5 feet 4 inches with silver hair, always pulled back in a neat bun, wearing simple but well-made clothes that spoke of quiet elegance rather than flashy wealth. Her hands, whether from years of hard work, told the real story of who she was. These weren't the manicured hands of someone who'd inherited her fortune. They were the hands of a builder, a creator, a woman who'd turned dreams into reality one brick at a time. You see, Maggie and her late husband Thomas had started with nothing but a dream and a small bed and breakfast nestled along the coast of Maine. Picture this: a tiny place with just 6 rooms, creaky floors, and windows that rattle when the Atlantic winds picked up. But what that little place lacked in luxury, it made up for in heart. Maggie would wake up at 5 a.m. every morning, baking fresh blueberry muffins, the recipe her grandmother had taught her, while Thomas tended to the gardens that would later become their signature feature. The smell of those muffins, mixed with the salt air and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below, created something magical. Guests didn't just stay at their bed and breakfast. They fell in love with it. They'd write letters months later, asking when they could return, telling their friends about the quiet woman who remembered exactly how they liked their coffee and the man who could tell stories about every lighthouse along the coast. But here's where the story really begins to unfold into one of those profound elderly wisdom stories that teaches us about the true meaning of legacy. Maggie never sought the spotlight. While Thomas charmed the guests with his stories and easy laughter, Maggie worked behind the scenes. She was the one who noticed when the furnace needed repair before it broke down completely. She was the one who remembered that Mrs. Patterson from Boston was allergic to shellfish, and she made sure to have a special meal prepared every time she visited. She was the one who stayed up late, poring over the books, figuring out how they could expand without losing the personal touch that made their place special. And expand they did. 1 bed and breakfast became 2, then 5, then a dozen. But Maggie insisted that each location maintain that same feeling, that sense of coming home to a place where you were truly welcomed. She would personally visit each property, training the staff not just on procedures, but on the art of making people feel valued. Remember their names, she'd tell new employees. Remember their stories. That's what turns a guest into family. By the time Maggie was in her 60s, the Simmons Hotel Group had become a household name along the eastern seaboard. Luxury coastal resorts that celebrities chose for their weddings, business conferences, and romantic getaways. But if you asked Maggie about her success, she'd deflect the credit to Thomas, to their employees, to luck, to anyone but herself. The truth was Maggie's wisdom, the kind of elderly wisdom that comes from decades of putting others first, had built something extraordinary. She understood that true hospitality wasn't about thread count or marble bathrooms. It was about making people feel seen, valued, and cared for. Every decision she made, from the color of the towels to the training programs for her housekeeping staff, was guided by the simple principle: how can we make someone's day a little brighter? Thomas passed away 3 years ago, peacefully in his sleep after a day spent walking through their original property's gardens. Maggie grieved quietly, the way she did everything else. She continued to run the business with the same steady hand, the same attention to detail. But there was a loneliness now that she tried to fill by throwing herself even deeper into her work. Which brings us to Emily, Maggie's only child and the heart of our story. Emily Simmons, now Emily Simmons Blake, as she preferred to be called professionally, was everything her mother was not. Where Maggie was understated, Emily was bold. Where Maggie preferred the background, Emily thrived in the spotlight. At 35, Emily had built a successful career as a fashion designer, with her own line carried in high-end department stores from New York to Los Angeles. Emily's Instagram account boasted over 200,000 followers who eagerly consumed her posts about Fashion Week, charity galas, and her carefully curated lifestyle. Her apartment on the Upper East Side was featured in Architectural Digest. Her designs were worn by soap opera actresses and socialites' wives. By any external measure, Emily had made it. But here's where this story starts to reveal the kind of wise advice that only comes from experience, from watching relationships unfold over decades. Success without connection is just expensive loneliness. Maggie had tried, over the years, to maintain a close relationship with her daughter. She'd attend Emily's fashion shows, sitting in the back row, beaming with quiet pride. She'd send thoughtful gifts, not expensive ones, but meaningful ones. A vintage sewing machine she'd found in an estate sale. A book about textile history. A photo of Emily as a child, helping her grandmother in the garden, now beautifully framed. But as Emily's career flourished, the distance between mother and daughter grew. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent. Emily was busy, always busy, with shoots and meetings and networking events. Maggie understood she'd been busy too, building their empire. But she also knew that all the success in the world meant nothing if you didn't have people to share it with. This understanding, this elderly wisdom born from a lifetime of watching what truly mattered, would soon be put to the ultimate test. Because sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. And sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to step back and let silence speak louder than words ever could. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March, just as Maggie was reviewing the quarterly reports from their Nantucket property. Emily's voice bubbled with excitement through the phone, higher pitched than usual, the way it got when she was really animated about something. "Mom, I have the most incredible news." Emily practically sang into the phone. Daniel proposed. Can you believe it? He did it at sunset on his family's yacht in the Hamptons, and there was a photographer hidden behind the mast to capture the whole thing. The ring is absolutely stunning. 3 carats, emerald cut, flawless clarity. We're already planning the most amazing wedding. Maggie set down her reading glasses and felt her heart swell with genuine joy. Daniel Morrison was the heir to a tech fortune, handsome in that polished way that looked perfect in society photos. More importantly, he seemed to make Emily happy, and that was all Maggie had ever wanted for her daughter. "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful news," Maggie said, her voice warm with maternal love. "I'm so happy for you both. Tell me everything. When is the wedding? What can I do to help?" Emily launched into a breathless description of their plans. It would be a destination wedding, she explained, somewhere elegant and exclusive. They were thinking late September, when the weather would be perfect and the lighting ideal for photography. They wanted something intimate. Just close family and their most important friends. Maybe 100 guests, she said, laughing at how small that seemed compared to some of the weddings she'd attended. As Emily talked about flowers and photographers, venue tours and dress fittings, Maggie found herself transported back to her own wedding day. She and Thomas had married in the tiny white church in their hometown, with a reception in the community center decorated with wildflowers Emily had helped her pick. The entire celebration had cost less than what Emily was probably planning to spend on centerpieces alone. But that didn't matter to Maggie. What mattered was the joy in her daughter's voice, the chance to be part of this milestone, to finally bridge some of the distance that had grown between them over the years. This wedding could be their opportunity to reconnect, to remember what family meant. "You know what, Mom?" Emily said, and Maggie could hear the smile in her voice. "I want this to be really special. I want it to be somewhere meaningful, somewhere with history and character, not just another cookie-cutter venue." Maggie's heart practically burst with pride and love. Here was her daughter, successful and independent, but still valuing the things that truly mattered: history, character, meaning. Maybe they weren't so different after all. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of excitement. Maggie threw herself into research, using her connections in the hospitality industry to scout potential venues. She called friends who owned historic estates, checked availability at renowned coastal resorts, even looked into castle rentals in Ireland that might capture Emily's vision of romance and elegance. But then Emily called again, her voice different this time, more businesslike, more decisive. "Mom, I found the perfect place," she announced. "It's this absolutely gorgeous estate on Martha's Vineyard, the Bellevue Manor. It overlooks the ocean, has these incredible gardens, and the ballroom has these soaring ceilings with crystal chandeliers. It's exactly what I've been dreaming of. Maggie paused, a strange feeling settling in her stomach. Bellevue Manor. She knew that name, knew it well, but she pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on her daughter's happiness. That sounds beautiful, darling. Maggie said carefully. Have you put down a deposit? Oh, yes. Daniel handled all of that. Emily replied breezily. His assistant worked with the wedding planner to book everything. The venue, the catering, even the hotel rooms for all our guests. It's going to be absolutely perfect. That's when Maggie decided to surprise her daughter with the most generous gift she could imagine. If Emily wanted perfect, if Emily wanted this dream wedding at this particular venue, then Maggie would make sure it happened. She would quietly, anonymously, take care of the venue fee, all $50,000 of it. It took just one phone call to make it happen. Maggie contacted Emily's wedding planner directly, explained that she wanted to cover the venue cost as a surprise gift for her daughter, and arranged for the payment to be processed immediately. She specifically requested that Emily not be told until after the wedding. She wanted this to be about Emily's day, not about her own generosity. The gesture filled Maggie with a warmth she hadn't felt in months. This was what money was for, not luxury cars or designer clothes, but moments like these, chances to show love in concrete ways, to support the dreams of the people who mattered most. For 3 weeks, Maggie lived in a bubble of anticipation. She shopped for the perfect mother-of-the-bride dress, settling on an elegant navy blue ensemble that would complement whatever color scheme Emily chose. She made an appointment with her hairdresser and bought new shoes. She even started thinking about what she might say if asked to give a toast, something heartfelt but brief, knowing Emily would want to focus on her and Daniel. The text message arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Maggie was in her office, reviewing menus for their upcoming spring events, when her phone buzzed with a message from Emily. Hey, Mom. So, about the wedding, we've been talking, and we'd really prefer you didn't come. It's going to be very intimate, and we want to keep the vibe light and fun. Hope you understand. Love you. Maggie read the message once, then again, then a third time, certain she must have misunderstood something. But there it was, in black and white digital letters that seemed to burn themselves into her retinas. We'd really prefer you didn't come. She set the phone down with hands that had begun to tremble slightly, the same hands that had kneaded thousands of batches of bread, that had signed contracts and built an empire, that had soothed Emily's fever brow when she was sick as a child. Now those hands shook as the full weight of her daughter's words settled over her like a cold fog rolling in from the ocean. $50,000. She had just spent $50,000 to ensure her daughter had the perfect wedding venue, a wedding she was now being told she couldn't attend. But that wasn't what hurt. The money was nothing compared to the devastating realization that her own child, the little girl she had raised and loved and sacrificed for, didn't want her at the most important day of her life. Maggie sat in her office as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the paper scattered on her desk. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the normal sound of her hotel's operations, phones ringing, staff members chatting in the hallways, the hum of success built on decades of hard work and dedication. But all of that seemed to fade into background noise as she confronted a pain deeper than anything she'd felt since Thomas's death. This was the moment when Maggie's elderly wisdom, earned through years of experience and heartbreak, would guide her to a response that no one, least of all Emily, would see coming. For 2 days after receiving Emily's text, Maggie moved through her daily routines like a woman underwater. She attended meetings, reviewed reports, and made decisions with her usual efficiency. But there was a hollow quality to her actions, as if she were watching herself from a great distance. The staff at her hotels noticed nothing different. Maggie had always been composed, professional, keeping her personal feelings separate from her work. But inside, she was processing a hurt so deep it felt like grief. On Saturday morning, she sat in Thomas's favorite chair on their porch, cradling a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The view from their home, perched on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, usually brought her peace. She and Thomas had chosen this spot specifically for mornings like this, when a lighthouse in the distance would catch the early sun, and the waves would paint white foam across the dark rock below. But today, the beauty felt distant, muted by the ache in her chest. She kept replaying Emily's message, searching for some context she might have missed, some reasonable explanation for why a mother would be uninvited from her only child's wedding. We want to keep the vibe light and fun. As if her presence would somehow darken the celebration, as if the woman who had given Emily life was now considered a burden. It was then, sitting in that chair where she and Thomas had shared countless morning conversations about their business, their dreams, and their daughter, that something clicked into place. Bellevue Manor. The name had been tugging at the edge of her consciousness for weeks, familiar in a way that went beyond casual recognition. Maggie rose and walked to Thomas's old desk. She still thought of it as his, though she'd been using it for 3 years now. She pulled out the thick leather binder that contained the complete portfolio of Simmons Hotel Group properties. Her fingers, steadier now with purpose, flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. There was Bellevue Manor, Martha's Vineyard, acquired in 2018 as part of their expansion into luxury estate venues. The property included the main mansion, extensive gardens, a private beach, and exclusive catering facilities. It was one of their most prestigious locations, booked solid months in advance by couples willing to pay premium rates for the privilege of saying their vows in such an exquisite setting. Emily was getting married at a venue owned by her own mother's company, the venue for which Maggie had just paid $50,000, essentially paying herself to host a wedding she wasn't invited to attend. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so heartbreaking. But as Maggie sat there, staring at the property photos she knew by heart, something shifted inside her. The raw pain of rejection began to crystallize into something else. Not anger exactly, but quiet clarity that comes with genuine elderly wisdom, the kind of understanding that only emerges after decades of watching human nature reveal itself in all its complexities. She reached for her phone and dialed the direct number for Sarah Chun, Bellevue Manor's event coordinator. Sarah had been with the company for 12 years, starting as an assistant and working her way up to managing their most exclusive events. Maggie had personally mentored her, teaching her that luxury wasn't just about expensive things. It was about attention to detail, anticipating needs before guests even realized they had them, and creating moments that would live in memory long after the event ended. Mrs. Simmons. Sarah's voice brightened with genuine warmth. What a lovely surprise. How are you doing? I'm well. Sarah, thank you for asking, Maggie replied, her voice carrying its usual professional composure. I'm calling about an event you have scheduled for late September, the Simmons-Morrison wedding. Oh, yes, absolutely beautiful event we have planned, Sarah enthused. The bride has exquisite taste, very specific about every detail, but in a good way. She knows exactly what she wants. Actually, it's funny you should call about that one. I was just reviewing the contracts this morning, and I noticed the venue fee was paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. That almost never happens. Usually, we're chasing final payments right up until the event date. Maggie felt a bitter smile tug at the corner of her mouth. Anonymous benefactor. That was one way to describe a mother's love. Sarah, I need you to pull up the complete contract package of that event, Maggie said, her tone shifting slightly. Sarah, with her years of experience reading Maggie's moods, immediately picked up on the change. Of course, Mrs. Simmons. Is there a problem? Just pull it up, please. I'll wait. As Sarah accessed the files, Maggie found herself thinking about all the conversations she and Thomas had had about legacy. Not just a business legacy, the hotels, the properties, the financial success, but the personal legacy. What kind of person were they raising? What values were they instilling? They had tried so hard to balance giving Emily opportunities with teaching her humility, to provide comfort without creating entitlement. Sitting there, waiting for Sarah to compile the information, Maggie realized they might have failed in ways she was only now beginning to understand. Okay, I have everything here, Sarah said, rustling papers. It's actually quite an extensive booking. They have the main ballroom for the ceremony and reception, the bridal suite for preparation, the groom's preparation room, and they reserved 18 guest rooms at the Vineyard Grand. That's our partner hotel property for out-of-town guests. The catering is being handled by Coastal Elegance, which I believe is also one of our subsidiary companies. And the flowers are coming from Garden Dreams, which, Sarah paused. Which is also one of ours. Mrs. Simmons, this is interesting. This wedding is essentially a complete Simmons hotel group event. Maggie closed her eyes. Emily hadn't just chosen a venue owned by her mother's company. She had, unknowingly, selected an entire wedding package where every major vendor, every service provider, every luxury accommodation was part of the empire Maggie had spent her lifetime building. The daughter who had uninvited her own mother was planning to celebrate the most important day of her life, surrounded entirely by her mother's life's work. Sarah, Maggie said quietly, her voice carrying a quality Sarah had never heard before, not anger, not sadness exactly, but something deeper and more resolute. I need you to cancel all of those contracts. I'm sorry, what? Cancel them? Mrs. Simmons, the wedding is in 3 weeks. The deposit alone. All deposits will be returned in full, Maggie interrupted gently. Cancel the venue. Cancel the catering. Cancel the hotel reservations. Everything. Today. There was a long pause. Sarah had worked with Maggie long enough to know that when her boss spoke in that particular tone, calm, quiet, but absolutely certain, there was no point in arguing. But she also cared enough about Maggie to ask the question that was burning in her mind. Mrs. Simmons, may I ask why? This is going to create tremendous hardship for the couple. 3 weeks' notice for a wedding of the scale. Maggie stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the lighthouse that had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century. Sometimes, Sarah, people need to understand the value of what they're willing to throw away. Sometimes the greatest kindness is allowing someone to face the consequences of their choices. And with that, Maggie Simmons, the quiet woman who had built an empire through patience, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to treating people with dignity, made a decision that would change everything, not through screaming or threats or dramatic confrontations, but through the simple, powerful act of withdrawal. Sometimes, the wisest advice comes not from words, but from actions. Sometimes, elderly wisdom manifests not as interference, but as the courage to step back and let reality teach the lessons that love alone cannot. Within hours of Maggie's phone call to Sarah, the machinery of cancellation began to move with the same quiet efficiency that had built the Simmons empire. There were no dramatic scenes, no angry outbursts, no vindictive pleasure taken in the process. Just a series of professional phone calls, polite emails, and the systematic unwinding of what was to have been Emily's perfect day. Sarah Chun had worked in the luxury hospitality industry long enough to handle difficult situations with grace, but this was unlike anything she'd encountered before. As she made each call, explaining that due to unforeseen circumstances, the Simmons Hotel Group needed to cancel their services for the Simmons-Morrison wedding, she found herself struck by the profound sadness of the situation. She didn't know the details. Maggie had offered no explanation beyond her initial instruction, but Sarah could hear something in her boss's voice that spoke of deep personal pain. The caterer at Coastal Elegance was the first to express concern. 3 weeks' notice? Sarah, you know how this industry works. They'll never find quality replacement catering with this short notice, especially not for a 100-person wedding on Martha's Vineyard in September. That's peak season. I understand, Sarah replied, her voice professional but sympathetic. Mrs. Simmons has authorized full deposit refunds and an additional compensation payment for any inconvenience. She wants to make this as painless as possible for all parties involved. But of course, it couldn't be painless. Not really. Because while money could compensate for financial losses, it couldn't restore the months of planning, the carefully orchestrated timeline, the delicate balance of logistics that made a luxury wedding possible. The floral designer had already ordered rare orchids from Thailand. The musicians had turned down other lucrative bookings. The photographer had blocked out an entire weekend, including travel time from New York. As each vendor received their cancellation notice, word began to spread through the tight-knit community of high-end wedding professionals. Martha's Vineyard in September was a small world, and everyone knew everyone. By Monday morning, the gossip mills were churning with speculation about what could cause such a last-minute cancellation from the typically reliable Simmons organization. Meanwhile, Maggie went about her daily routine with the same steady composure she'd maintained through every crisis of her business career. She attended her usual Tuesday morning meeting with her property managers, reviewed quarterly profit statements from their Boston location, and even approved plans for renovating the spa at their Newport resort. To anyone watching, she seemed exactly as she always did, focused, professional, quietly competent. But her assistant of 15 years, Janet Morrison, no relation to Emily's fiancé, despite the shared surname, noticed subtle changes. The way Maggie held her coffee cup just a moment longer before setting it down. The slight pause before answering questions that would normally receive immediate responses. The fact that she hadn't asked about Emily once, when usually their conversations included updates about her daughter's latest fashion show or social media post. Janet had been with Maggie long enough to understand that her boss processed emotional situations differently than most people. Where others might rage or weep or seek comfort in friends, Maggie turned inward, finding strength in solitude and clarity in quiet reflection. It was a trait that had served her well in business, the ability to make difficult decisions without being swayed by emotion. But Janet sometimes worried about the toll it took on Maggie's heart. On Wednesday morning, 48 hours after the cancellations had been set in motion, Emily's wedding planner, Vivian St. Clair, called in a state of barely controlled panic. "Mrs. Chun, I need to speak with Mrs. Simmons immediately." Vivian's usually composed voice trembled with stress. "There's been some terrible mistake with the Simmons-Morrison wedding. I've spent the last 2 days trying to secure replacement vendors, and it's impossible. Absolutely impossible. Do you understand what you've done? This isn't just any wedding. This is Emily Simmons' wedding. Her mother owns half the luxury hospitality venues on the East Coast, and now she's destroying her own daughter's wedding." Sarah, who had been fielding increasingly frantic calls since Monday, maintained her professional demeanor. "Mrs. St. Clair, I understand your distress, but there's been no mistake. Mrs. Simmons' instructions were very clear and deliberate. If you need to speak with her directly, I can arrange that, but I should warn you that her decision appears to be final." "Arrange it," Vivian demanded. "This is madness. Emily is beside herself. Daniel's family is asking questions. The guests are starting to hear rumors. This wedding has to happen." But Maggie, when Sarah relayed the wedding planner's request, simply shook her head. "No meetings, Sarah. No explanations. My decision stands." She paused, looking out the window of her office at the harbor, where she and Thomas had first dreamed of expanding beyond their little bed and breakfast. Sometimes people need to understand that actions have consequences. Emily made her choice when she decided I wasn't welcome at her wedding. Now she gets to live with that choice. It was then, perhaps, that Sarah began to understand what was really happening. This wasn't about business or contracts or vendor relationships. This was about a mother who had been rejected by the child she devoted her life to supporting. This was about decades of quiet sacrifice meeting ungrateful dismissal. This was about elderly wisdom choosing dignity over drama, choosing the power of withdrawal over the futility of confrontation. As Sarah returned to her office to make yet another round of calls, this time to finalize the last details of the cancellation process, she found herself thinking about her own relationship with her mother. How many times had she taken her mother's love for granted? How many times had she been too busy, too focused on her own life, to properly value the woman who had given her everything? The cancellation of Emily's wedding was spreading ripples far beyond the immediate parties involved. Other event coordinators were calling, asking if the Simmons organization was having financial difficulties. Vendors were gossiping about what could cause such unprecedented behavior from a company known for its reliability. And somewhere in New York City, a young woman who had built her identity around control and image was about to discover that the foundation of her perfect life was far less stable than she had ever imagined. But Maggie remained serene in her decision, sustained by the kind of elderly wisdom that comes from understanding the difference between being loved and being used, between being valued and being taken for granted. She had spent her life giving quietly and generously. Now, for the first time, she was taking something back, not in anger, but in dignity. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night, jarring Maggie from the first peaceful sleep she'd had in days. Emily's name flashed on her phone screen, and for just a moment, Maggie's maternal instincts almost made her answer immediately. But she let it ring, then ring again, and again. By Thursday morning, there were 17 missed calls from Emily, 12 from Daniel, and 43 text messages that ranged from confused to desperate to furious. Maggie read them all while sipping her morning coffee, her expression never changing as she witnessed her daughter's carefully constructed world beginning to collapse in real time. The first few messages were simply bewildered. "Mom, what's happening? Vivian says all our vendors canceled? Call me back ASAP." But as the hours passed and Maggie didn't respond, the tone shifted. By 2 a.m., Emily was texting, "I know you're upset about the wedding invite, but this is insane. You're ruining my life. How could you do this to me?" But it was a voicemail Emily left at 3:17 a.m. that revealed the depth of her panic and her complete inability to understand what she had done. "Mom, it's me again. I don't understand what's happening. Daniel's parents are freaking out because they've already booked flights and hotels. My dress fitting is tomorrow, and I don't even know if we're having a wedding anymore. Vivian says she can't find any decent venues with 3 weeks' notice. The photographers are all booked. The florists are saying it's impossible. Mom, please, you have to fix this. I know I hurt your feelings, but we can talk about that later. Right now, I need you to call these people back and fix this mess." Fix this mess. As if the systematic unraveling of Emily's wedding was some sort of accident, some misunderstanding that could be resolved with a few phone calls. As if Maggie's decades of sacrifice and love were something that could be set aside while her daughter's convenience was restored. That Thursday afternoon, Emily showed up unannounced at Maggie's office. She swept past Janet's desk without acknowledging the older woman, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors with the same sharp precision as her anger. She burst through Maggie's door without knocking, her face flushed and her carefully styled hair disheveled from running her hands through it, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation. She stood in front of Maggie's desk like an accusing angel, her whole body vibrating with indignation. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand that you've destroyed months of planning? That you've humiliated me in front of Daniel's family? In front of everyone?" Maggie looked up from the contract she'd been reviewing, her expression calm and measured. She took in her daughter's appearance. The expensive outfit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, the jewelry that sparkled even in the office's subdued lighting, the face that was beautiful but contorted with an ugly anger that transformed her features into something Maggie hardly recognized. "Hello, Emily," Maggie said quietly. "Please, sit down." "I don't want to sit down. I want you to explain why you've lost your mind and decided to sabotage my wedding." Emily's voice rose higher, and Maggie could hear Janet closing the outer office door to give them privacy. "I didn't sabotage your wedding, sweetheart," Maggie replied, her tone remaining steady. "I simply withdrew my services from an event I wasn't welcome to attend." "Your services?" Emily's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "What are you talking about? We booked those vendors ourselves. We paid for everything ourselves." And there it was, the moment that revealed just how little Emily understood about the empire her mother had built, about the web of businesses and relationships that had made her perfect wedding possible in the first place. "Did you, Emily?" Maggie asked gently. "Did you really look into who owned Bellevue Manor? Who owned the catering company, the floral design service, the hotel where your guests were staying?" Emily's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, dawning realization, and then a defensive anger that was almost heartbreaking to watch. That doesn't matter. Those are businesses. That's not personal, isn't it?" Maggie stood up and walked around her desk, moving to the window that looked out over the harbor. "Emily, I paid the $50,000 venue fee for your wedding. I paid it as a gift, as a surprise for you and Daniel. I wanted your day to be perfect." Emily's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. The expensive wedding planner, the months of careful coordination, the sense of control she felt over every detail. It was all built on her mother's generosity, her mother's business empire, her mother's quiet support, and she had never even known. "But that was before," Maggie continued, still looking out at the water, "before you decided that my presence would somehow damage the vibe of your celebration. Before you decided that the woman who gave you life, who raised you, who built the very foundation that made your lifestyle possible, wasn't worthy of witnessing the most important day of your life. Mom, that wasn't. Emily started, but Maggie held up a hand. Let me finish, please. Maggie's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions. For 35 years, I have put your happiness before my own. When you wanted to go to that expensive private school, your father and I worked 18-hour days to afford the tuition. When you wanted to study fashion in Paris, we made it happen. When you needed startup money for your business, who do you think co-signed those loans? Each word landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of realization that spread across Emily's consciousness. She began to see, perhaps for the first time, the invisible scaffolding of support that had made her independence possible. But I never asked for recognition, Maggie continued, turning back to face her daughter. I never demanded gratitude or credit. I did those things because I loved you, because that's what mothers do. But love isn't a bottomless well, Emily. Even a mother's love has limits. And when your own child tells you that your presence at the most important moment of her life would be unwelcome, well, that's where I draw the line. Emily stood frozen in the middle of the office, her anger deflating into something that looked almost like fear. For the first time in her adult life, she was seeing her mother not as an endless source of support and resources, but as a human being with feelings that could be wounded, with dignity that could be trampled, with love that could be pushed beyond its breaking point. Mom, I mean, Emily's voice had lost all its earlier fire, replaced by something small and uncertain. Didn't mean what exactly? Maggie asked, and now there was an edge to her voice that Emily had never heard before. Didn't mean to exclude me from your wedding? Didn't mean to dismiss me with a casual text message? Didn't mean to treat me like an embarrassing relative who might somehow diminish your perfect day? The silence stretched between them, filled with 35 years of misunderstandings, unspoken expectations, and the slow erosion of a relationship that had once been the center of both their worlds. Emily opened her mouth several times as if to speak, but no words came. How could she explain that it hadn't been about embarrassment or shame, but about image and perception? How could she make her mother understand that in her world of Instagram followers and society pages, everything had to be carefully curated, perfectly orchestrated? But even as she searched for words, Emily began to realize how hollow those explanations would sound. How selfish. How cruel. I can fix this, Emily finally whispered, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. I can call the vendors myself. I can... No, Maggie said firmly. You can't fix this, Emily, because this was never about the vendors or the venues. This was about respect. This was about recognition. This was about understanding that the people who love you most deserve better than to be dismissed when they become inconvenient. And with that, Maggie walked past her daughter toward the door. But she paused with her hand on the handle, looking back at the young woman who was crying in the middle of her office. Not the confident socialite or successful businesswoman, but a lost child who was finally beginning to understand the cost of her choices. I hope someday you'll understand that this wasn't about punishment, Emily. This was about teaching you something I should have taught you long ago, that love without respect isn't really love at all. It's just dependency dressed up in prettier clothes. What happened next was something that neither Maggie nor Emily could have fully anticipated, though perhaps Maggie's decades of business experience had given her some inkling of how quickly private pain could become public spectacle. In the age of social media and instant communication, secrets don't stay secret for long, especially when they involve the wealthy and well-connected. It started small, as these things always do. Someone at the florist's office mentioned to a friend about the crazy last-minute cancellation of a major wedding. That friend happened to be a freelance writer for a lifestyle blog who specialized in wedding industry gossip. By Friday afternoon, a small item appeared in the Wedding Wire Whispers column. Which socialite daughter hotel heiress is scrambling to find new vendors after mysterious cancellations threaten her dream wedding? Emily, who had Google alerts set up for her own name and regularly monitored mentions of her brand, spotted the item within hours. She called Daniel in a panic, then called her publicist, then spent the rest of the evening frantically texting anyone who might be able to help contain what she correctly sensed could become a much larger story. But Emily had always understood the power of social media as a tool for building her brand. She had never fully grasped how quickly that same tool could destroy it. By Saturday morning, someone had connected the dots between the wedding cancellation story and Emily's own social media posts about planning her dream wedding at an exclusive Martha's Vineyard venue. A quick search of property records revealed that Bellevue Manor was owned by Simmons Hotel Group. Another search revealed that Emily Simmons was a daughter of Margaret Simmons, the notoriously private hotel heiress. The story exploded across social media with the force of every family drama that touches on universal themes of love, disappointment, and consequences. Hashtag wedding canceled began trending on Twitter. Instagram accounts dedicated to wedding fails picked up the story. The comments sections filled with speculation, judgment, and a kind of gleeful schadenfreude that social media seems designed to amplify. But it was the emergence of additional details that transformed the story from mere gossip into a broader conversation about family relationships, entitled behavior, and the wisdom that comes with experience. Someone, and Emily never found out who, leaked information about the timeline of events. The $50,000 venue fee paid anonymously by a benefactor who turned out to be the mother of the bride had Uninvited. The systematic cancellation of every vendor, all connected to the same family business empire. Suddenly, Emily found herself cast not as a victim of a vindictive parent, but as the ungrateful daughter who had bitten the hand that fed her. The comments were brutal in their clarity. Imagine being so entitled that you uninvite your own mother from your wedding, then act surprised when she doesn't want to pay for it. This is what happens when you mistake your parents' love for an entitlement program. The mother showed more class in her silence than the daughter did in all her social media posts combined. That last comment particularly stung because it was true. While Emily had been posting increasingly frantic updates about vendor issues and family complications, Maggie had maintained complete public silence. No interviews, no statements, no social media posts of her own. Her dignity in the face of public scrutiny only made Emily's behavior look worse by comparison. The story caught the attention of larger media outlets when Page 6 picked it up on Sunday with a headline, "Hotel heiress pulls plug on daughter's dream wedding after being uninvited." The article included quotes from industry insiders who painted a picture of Emily as someone who had consistently taken her mother's support for granted while building her own public persona. But it was a Monday morning segment on Good Morning America that really drove home the cultural significance of what was happening. The show's lifestyle correspondent, interviewing a family therapist about the story, asked a question that was on everyone's minds. At what point does a parent stop enabling an adult child's bad behavior? Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the therapist, delivered what would become one of the most shared quotes of the entire controversy. This mother's response demonstrates something we rarely see in our culture, the wisdom to understand that true love sometimes requires allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their choices. She didn't retaliate with anger or drama. She simply withdrew her support from someone who had made it clear they didn't value her presence. That's not punishment. That's dignity. The segment included a brief discussion about what Dr. Mitchell called elderly wisdom in family dynamics, the idea that older adults who have lived through decades of relationships often develop a deeper understanding of when to hold on and when to let go. This mother's decision, Dr. Mitchell explained, shows the kind of wise advice that comes from experience. She understood that continuing to enable her daughter's dismissive behavior wouldn't help anyone in the long run. Emily watched the segment from her apartment, feeling each word like a physical blow. The worst part wasn't the public embarrassment, though that was devastating enough for someone who had built her career on her image. The worst part was the growing realization that the commentators were right, that her mother's silence wasn't vindictive or cruel, but was actually the most loving thing she could have done under the circumstances. Daniel, meanwhile, was dealing with pressure from his own family. His parents, successful in their own right but far more traditional in their values, were horrified by the public portrayal of their son's fiancée as an ungrateful, entitled socialite. His mother had already called twice to express her concerns about Emily's character, using the kind of diplomatically neutral language that Emily correctly interpreted as complete disapproval. "Maybe we should postpone," Daniel suggested during one particularly difficult conversation on Tuesday evening. "Let this all blow over. Give you time to work things out with your mother." But Emily could hear something in his voice that terrified her more than any media coverage. doubt. For the first time since their relationship began, Daniel was questioning whether she was the kind of person he wanted to spend his life with. The wedding crisis had revealed aspects of her personality that their courtship, built on glamorous dates and carefully curated experiences, had never exposed. As Emily sat in her beautifully appointed apartment, scrolling through endless commentary about her family drama, she began to understand something that all the social media followers and fashion industry success had never taught her. She began to understand the difference between being famous and being respected, between being envied and being loved, between building an image and building a character. The elderly wisdom her mother had tried to impart over the years, through quiet example rather than lectures, through actions rather than words, was finally beginning to penetrate Emily's consciousness. But the question remained, was it too late? Had she damaged the most important relationship in her life beyond repair? And even if her mother could forgive her, could Emily forgive herself for taking so long to understand what should have been obvious all along? The weight of that realization would prove to be heavier than any public embarrassment, more devastating than any canceled wedding, and more transformative than any lesson she had ever learned. In the days that followed the media explosion, Emily prepared for the confrontation she was certain would come. She crafted speeches in her mind, rehearsed explanations and apologies, imagined heated exchanges where she would finally be forced to defend her actions to her mother face to face. She half expected Maggie to arrive at her apartment in a fury, or to summon her to another office meeting where the elder woman would unleash all the hurt and disappointment Emily had caused. But the confrontation never came. Instead, there was something far more powerful and devastating. Silence. Maggie continued her daily routines with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her entire career. She attended board meetings, reviewed property reports, and made decisions about renovations and expansions as if nothing had changed. When employees tentatively asked if she was all right, the story had made enough news that everyone in the hospitality industry knew about it. She simply nodded and redirected the conversation back to business matters. This response confounded Emily in ways that anger never could have. She had built her entire understanding of conflict around drama, raised voices, and emotional showdowns. Her world of fashion and social media thrived on public feuds, Instagram stories filled with cryptic references to fake friends, and the kind of performative relationship struggles that generated engagement and sympathy from followers. But Maggie's silence offered no target for Emily's defensive instincts, no ammunition for her justifications. It was a kind of response that could only come from elderly wisdom, the understanding that some lessons can't be taught through words, that some relationships can't be repaired through explanations, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is allow someone to sit with the full weight of their choices. Janet, Maggie's longtime assistant, watched her boss navigate this period with a mixture of admiration and concern. She had seen Maggie handle hostile takeovers, natural disasters that damaged properties, and the grief of losing Thomas. But this was different. This was personal in a way that business crises never were, and Janet worried about the emotional toll of maintaining such composed dignity, while her heart was clearly breaking. Mrs. Simmons, Janet ventured one afternoon as Maggie reviewed quarterly reports. You know that Emily's been calling the office. She's left 17 messages with me this week alone. Maggie looked up from her papers, her reading glasses reflecting the afternoon light streaming through her office windows. I know, Janet. Thank you for handling those. Would you like me to continue taking messages? Or would you prefer I tell her you're unavailable indefinitely? It was a kind of practical question that Janet excelled at, cutting through emotional complexity to address the simple logistics of a difficult situation. But Maggie's answer revealed the depth of thought she had given to her response. Continue taking messages, but don't offer any hope of return call. Emily needs to understand that relationships aren't like business contracts where you can negotiate terms after you've broken the original agreement. Some things once said can't be unsaid. Some wounds once inflicted change the shape of love permanently. That evening, alone in the home she had shared with Thomas, Maggie found herself thinking about the different kinds of wisdom that age brings. There was practical wisdom, the kind that helped you run a successful business, make sound investments, and navigate the complexities of professional relationships. But there was also emotional wisdom, the harder-won understanding of human nature that came from decades of watching people reveal their true characters under pressure. She thought about Emily as a little girl, the way she used to follow Maggie around the original bed and breakfast, helping with tasks that she was far too young to actually assist with. The memory that came most clearly was of 5-year-old Emily trying to fold towels in the laundry room, her small hands creating wrinkled messes that Maggie would quietly refold after Emily had moved on to the next task. Back then, Maggie had seen Emily's determination to help as a sign of good character, evidence that she was raising a child who understood the value of contribution and hard work. But perhaps Maggie now realized she had been too quick to praise Emily's efforts without ensuring she understood the underlying values. Perhaps she had been so focused on maintaining Emily's self-esteem that she had failed to teach her the humility that comes from genuine accomplishment earned through struggle. The irony wasn't lost on Maggie that Emily's current crisis, the first real consequence she had faced for treating someone poorly, might actually be the most valuable gift Maggie could give her daughter. Not the expensive education, not the business connections, not the financial safety net, but the hard lesson that actions have consequences and relationships require reciprocal respect to survive. Meanwhile, Daniel's doubts about their relationship were crystallizing into something more definitive. The man Emily had fallen in love with, successful, ambitious, but also raised with traditional values about family loyalty, was increasingly uncomfortable with what the wedding crisis had revealed about his fiancée's character. His parents' disapproval was one factor, but more troubling was his own growing realization that he didn't recognize the woman he had proposed to. The Emily he thought he knew was confident but kind, successful but grounded. The Emily revealed by recent events was someone who could casually dismiss her own mother, who could take years of support for granted, who could respond to consequences with rage rather than reflection. Daniel began to wonder what other aspects of her character he had failed to see during their courtship. 3 weeks after the cancellations, Daniel made a decision that would complete the collapse of Emily's carefully constructed world. He called off their engagement entirely, not just the wedding but the relationship itself. His explanation was brief and devastating in its clarity. I can't marry someone who treats her own mother the way you treated yours. If that's how you handle family, how would you handle marriage when things get difficult? The end of her engagement, following so closely after the public humiliation and the realization of how much she had taken her mother for granted, forced Emily into the kind of genuine self-reflection she had avoided her entire adult life. For the first time, she began to understand that the elderly wisdom her mother had tried to share over the years, through example, through quiet guidance, through unconditional love, might have saved her from this devastating moment if she had only been wise enough to listen. But understanding and redemption are two different things, and Emily was about to learn that some damage, once done, can't be undone simply through regret and good intentions. The silence from her mother continued, as profound and immovable as the ocean that had witnessed the building of their family empire and was now witnessing its personal dissolution. 6 months had passed since what the media had dubbed the wedding that wasn't, and autumn was painting the coastal landscape in brilliant shades of amber and crimson. Maggie sat in her favorite chair on the porch, the same spot where she had processed Emily's devastating text message all those months ago. But something fundamental had shifted in the intervening time, not just in her relationship with her daughter, but in her understanding of her own strength and worth. The business had continued to thrive under her steady leadership. In fact, the publicity from the wedding controversy had, unexpectedly, brought positive attention to the Simmons Hotel Group. Many potential clients were impressed by what they saw as Maggie's principled stand, her refusal to allow personal relationships to compromise her professional standards. Bookings had actually increased, with several high-profile clients specifically requesting to work with a company that demonstrated such integrity in family matters. But Maggie took no pleasure in this ironic success. She had never wanted her private pain to become a marketing advantage, never sought to profit from the breakdown of her relationship with Emily. The elderly wisdom that had guided her response to Emily's rejection had been about dignity and self-respect, not public relations or business growth. Janet had just brought her the afternoon mail when Maggie spotted a familiar handwriting on one of the envelopes. Emily's distinctive script, which Maggie had seen evolve from a child's careful printing to the flowing signature that now graced fashion magazines and society event programs. This wasn't another desperate phone message or email that could be filtered through assistants. This was something Emily had taken time to write by hand, to think through, to craft with intention. Maggie held the letter for several minutes before opening it, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her garden. Thomas had planted those gardens himself, choosing plants that would bloom in sequence throughout the seasons so that there would always be something beautiful to see from this porch. Now, as the chrysanthemums reached their peak and the maple trees began their spectacular transformation, Maggie felt the weight of time passing, the awareness that relationships, like seasons, have their cycles of growth and dormancy and sometimes permanent change. When she finally opened Emily's letter, she found not the dramatic apology she might have expected, but something quieter and more profound. Dear Mom, I've started this letter 100 times, and I keep throwing away drafts because nothing I write seems adequate to express what I need to say. I've spent these months trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt you so deeply, someone who could take your love so completely for granted. I think I could finally understand that you weren't being vindictive when you canceled the wedding vendors. You were being wise. You were teaching me something I was too stubborn and too selfish to learn any other way. You were showing me that love without respect isn't really love at all. It's just selfish taking disguise as affection. I don't know if you can forgive me, and I'm not writing this letter to ask you to. I'm writing because I need you to know that I finally understand what I threw away. Not just your support for my wedding, but years and years of quiet sacrifice, patient guidance, and unconditional love that I never properly valued because it was always just there. I've been seeing a therapist, Dr. Patricia Wong, who specializes in family relationships. She's helping me understand how I developed such an entitled perspective on your love, how I came to see your support as something owed to me rather than something freely given. She says the fact that I'm finally questioning my own behavior is a sign of growth, but I know it's probably too late for us. Daniel and I are no longer together, as I'm sure you've heard. He said he couldn't respect someone who treated their mother the way I treated you, and he was right. I couldn't respect me either. Once I finally saw myself clearly, I'm not the same person who sent you that text message uninviting you for my wedding. I wish I could say that becoming a better person automatically repairs the damage I've done, but I'm learning that growth and redemption are two different things. I can become worthy of your love again, but that doesn't mean I'm entitled to receive it. I want you to know that everything good in my life, my education, my career opportunities, my sense of security in the world, grew from the foundation you and Dad built. I was so focused on creating my own identity that I forgot to honor the people who made that identity possible. If there's ever a chance for us to rebuild some kind of relationship, I want you to know I'm ready to earn it, not through grand gestures or public apologies, but through the quiet consistency of better choices, better character, better appreciation for the people who love me. I love you, Mom. I've always loved you, even when I was too selfish to show it properly. And I'm finally old enough to understand that love isn't just a feeling. It's a practice, a choice, a daily commitment to treating the people who matter with the respect they deserve. Your daughter, Emily. Maggie read the letter twice, then set it gently on the small table beside her chair. The afternoon light was fading, and the automatic lights were beginning to illuminate the pathways through Thomas's garden. She found herself thinking about the different seasons of love, the spring enthusiasm of new relationships, the full summer of established partnership, the autumn reflection when you begin to see patterns more clearly, and sometimes the winter dormancy when relationships need time to rest before they can grow again. The letter revealed a maturity in Emily that Maggie hadn't seen before, a willingness to take responsibility without making excuses, to acknowledge harm without immediately asking for forgiveness. It was the kind of wisdom that usually came from experience, from making mistakes and living with their consequences long enough to truly understand their impact. But Maggie also understood, with the deep knowledge that comes from decades of observing human nature, that recognizing a mistake isn't the same as undoing its effects. Emily's letter was beautiful, and it demonstrated real growth, but it couldn't restore the trust that had been broken. It couldn't undo the months of silence, the public humiliation, or the fundamental revelation that her own daughter had seen her as disposable when she became inconvenient. As darkness settled over the landscape, Maggie made a decision that surprised even herself. She would respond to Emily's letter, not to offer immediate forgiveness or reconciliation, but to acknowledge her daughter's growth while maintaining appropriate boundaries. She would demonstrate the same elderly wisdom that had guided her through this entire crisis, the understanding that healing happens slowly, that respect must be rebuilt gradually, and that some relationships, once damaged, require complete reconstruction rather than simple repair. The letter she would write would be kind but honest, warm but realistic. She would tell Emily that she was proud of her daughter's self-reflection and personal growth. She would also make it clear that redemption is a process, not an event, and that earning back trust requires consistent actions over time, not just beautiful words on paper. But most importantly, Maggie would tell Emily something she was only now beginning to fully understand herself. That sometimes the greatest act of love is maintaining your own dignity and self-respect, even when it means accepting that some relationships may never return to what they once were. Sometimes wisdom means knowing when to hold on and when to let go, when to forgive and when to require accountability, when to hope for healing and when to find peace and acceptance. As Maggie rose from her chair and prepared to go inside, she felt not the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet strength that comes from knowing you've handled a difficult situation with grace, wisdom, and integrity. The elderly wisdom that had guided her through this crisis wasn't about winning or losing. It was about living with honor, treating yourself and others with dignity, and understanding that true love sometimes requires difficult choices that benefit everyone in the long run, even when they hurt in the moment. 1 year had passed since Emily's letter, and the seasons had completed their full cycle. Spring had returned to coastal Maine, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of renewal that Maggie had come to find comforting in their predictability. The daffodils Thomas had planted were emerging from the thawing ground, and the early morning light carried that particular quality of hope that comes with the end of a long winter. Maggie's response to Emily's letter had been measured and thoughtful, reflecting the kind of elderly wisdom that understands the difference between forgiveness and restoration. She had acknowledged Emily's growth while making it clear that rebuilding their relationship would require time, consistency, and a fundamental shift in how they related to each other. There would be no quick return to their previous dynamic, no pretending that deep wounds could heal overnight. Emily's response to her mother's careful boundaries had been telling. Instead of pushing for immediate reconciliation or becoming frustrated with the gradual pace of healing, she had demonstrated something Maggie had never seen from her before: patience. Emily had begun sending brief, thoughtful notes every few weeks, not asking for anything, not pushing for meetings or phone calls, just sharing updates about her life and expressing gratitude for things she had previously taken for granted. The notes revealed a daughter who was genuinely trying to understand her mother's perspective. Emily wrote about small moments of recognition, seeing an elderly woman dining alone at a restaurant and thinking about how many times her mother must have eaten alone while Emily was too busy to call, noticing a mother helping her adult daughter move apartments and realizing she had never properly thanked Maggie for all the time she had dropped everything to provide support during Emily's various life transitions. Most importantly, Emily had stopped trying to manage the narrative of their relationship. Her social media presence had become notably more authentic, less performative. When friends asked about her mother, she spoke honestly about having made serious mistakes and working to become someone worthy of a second chance. The growth was real and Maggie could see it. But she also understood that recognizing someone's progress doesn't obligate you to immediately restore the relationship they had damaged. Janet had retired at the end of the previous year, and as Maggie was training her replacement, she found herself reflecting on the nature of loyalty and service. Janet had worked for her for 15 years, had been there through Thomas's death, had witnessed the entire Emily crisis with discreet professionalism. At her retirement dinner, Janet had pulled Maggie aside for a private conversation. "Mrs. Simmons," Janet had said, "I hope you know that watching how you handled this situation with Emily has been one of the most valuable lessons of my career. You showed me what it looks like to maintain your dignity in the face of personal betrayal, how to respond to hurt with wisdom instead of revenge. That's elderly wisdom at its finest, knowing that some battles are won not by fighting, but by refusing to participate in destructive behavior." Those words had stayed with Maggie throughout the winter months as she contemplated what kind of legacy she wanted to leave, not just in business, but in life. The Simmons Hotel group would continue long after she was gone, but what lessons was she modeling for people around her? What kind of wise advice was her life providing to those who observed how she navigated relationships, challenges, and disappointments? On this particular spring morning, as Maggie sat with her coffee and watched the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of gold and pink, she realized that the Emily crisis had taught her something unexpected about her own strength. For decades, she had defined herself primarily through her relationships. As Thomas's partner, as Emily's mother, as a caretaker and supporter of others' dreams. The forced independence of the past year had reminded her that she was also a complete person in her own right, someone whose worth didn't depend on how well she served others' needs. This was perhaps the most profound elderly wisdom of all, understanding that love and boundaries aren't opposites, but partners, that you can deeply care for someone while refusing to enable their poor behavior, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is maintain standards that require others to grow rather than adjusting your expectations to accommodate their weaknesses. Emily's latest note, which had arrived the previous week, showed continued evidence of this growth. She had written about starting volunteer work at a local shelter, helping elderly women who had nowhere to go for the holidays. "I kept thinking about how alone you must have felt," Emily had written, "and I realized I wanted to do something to help other people feel less alone, instead of just focusing on my own problems all the time." The note hadn't asked for anything. No request for visits, no pushing for faster reconciliation. It was simply a daughter sharing her attempt to become a better person, not for her mother's approval, but because she finally understood that good character was its own reward. Reading that note, Maggie had felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine pride in her daughter, not for external achievements or social media success, but for character development. Emily was finally becoming the person Maggie had always hoped she could be. Not through lectures or demands, but through experiencing the natural consequences of her choices and deciding she wanted to be better. Whether their relationship would ever fully heal remained to be seen. Maggie had learned not to invest too heavily in outcomes beyond her control. But she had also learned that you could love someone deeply while accepting that your relationship with them might need to take a different form than you had originally envisioned. As she prepared to head into the office for another day of building the legacy she and Thomas had created together, Maggie reflected on the story that would be told about her life someday. She hoped it would be remembered not just as a tale of business success, but as an example of how to love with wisdom, how to maintain dignity in difficult relationships, and how to understand that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the space to grow into their better self. The elderly wisdom stories that had guided her through this crisis weren't found in books or seminars. They were written in the quiet moments of choosing dignity over drama, respect over revenge, and long-term healing over short-term peace. They were stories of understanding that true love sometimes requires difficult choices, that wisdom often looks like patience, and that the most powerful response to hurt is often the quiet strength of moving forward with integrity intact. Standing on her porch one final moment before heading to work, Maggie smiled at the thought that somewhere, Emily was probably starting her own day with new awareness of what really mattered. And perhaps someday, when Emily was older and facing her own relationship challenges, she would remember the lesson her mother had taught her, that love without respect isn't really love at all, and that the wisest advice often comes not through words, but through the example of how we choose to live our lives when tested by disappointment and betrayal. In the end, that might be the most valuable inheritance Maggie could leave her daughter. Not money or business success, but the understanding of how to love wisely, how to maintain boundaries with grace, and how to turn personal pain into wisdom that could guide future generations toward healthier, more respectful relationships. This story of Margaret and Emily Simmons reminds us that the greatest elderly wisdom often comes from those who have learned to balance love with dignity, who understand that true affection requires mutual respect, and who have discovered that sometimes the most powerful response to being undervalued is the quiet strength of knowing your own worth. In our relationships with family, friends, and community, may we all aspire to the kind of wisdom that builds rather than destroys, that teaches rather than punishes, and that demonstrates through our actions the values we hope to pass on to future generations.